So hi everyone, I'm Varun Nigesh. I'm a PhD student at UCLA. So today I'll be discussing some of our work on effect of fines on liquefaction triggering analysis. So most of you might have performed liquefaction triggering analysis to estimate the CRR of a soil or site using the measured penetration resistance. So often when we encounter fines in these soil sites, we try to account for this by applying empirical correction factors. So these correction factors are purely regressed from the database, and there is no solid evidence backing up these correction factors, whether they are able to take into account the influence of fines on CRR as well as the measured penetration resistance. So even in some cases, you might actually correct your measured CPT values to almost 5 times and say, oh, my CRR is very high, so I don't really have to bother much. So through this talk, I'll be putting forth some preliminary work we have done in this area. So before we go into the technical details, I'd like to thank Peer and Caltrans for funding this project through Peer-2024 program. And I'd also like to extend my gratitude to Sharon, Katie, and Tom for their support throughout this project. Yeah, so like I said, fines have two separate influence on triggering analysis. So firstly, they influence the CRR, so which can basically shift your triggering curve either up or down. Similarly, they also influence the tip resistance. So you expect the curve to move laterally. So as a part of our work, we are trying to look at both these effects independently and see if the existing models are able to capture both these effects. So first, let's start with the effect of fines on CRR. So depending on the amount of fines present, we are having different sorts of force chain contacts in the mixture. When the fines content is much lower than the so-called threshold fines content, the mechanical properties of the mixture are dominated by the coarse grain particles. So as your fines content increases further beyond the threshold value, the property is going to be dominated by the fine grain particles. So this particular threshold value is typically within the 20 to 40% range. So when we have a look at the studies in the literature, which are purely conducted to understand the effect of fines on CRR, we have different conclusions. So firstly, in this plot, we have the data from Polito and Martin. So these are tests that are performed at a constant relative density. So as you can see, the CRR is almost constant, and beyond some threshold value, the CRR is decreasing. On the other hand, when you have a look at Bhuminathan et al. 2010, the CRR is constantly decreasing as a function of fines content. Similarly, Amini and Key has other results. So they say that the CRR is increasing as a function of fines content. So in summary, there is no consensus in the literature on what the fines are going to do to the measured CRR. So to tackle this, we sought out to gather lots of lab test data from the literature, and with the hope that we can unify the findings somehow. So there are two different databases for our study. So firstly, we have used data from Carlton et al. To 2023. So they have gathered lots of cyclic test data from the literature that were focused mainly on understanding the overburden and static shear stress effects. Then furthermore, I have gathered additional 28 different studies which were purely focused on understanding the influence of fines on CR. So before we look at how the trends are, we need to process the data. So we have applied a bunch of corrections which are given by this equation here. So basically you have your K sigma K alpha corrections for your overburden and static shear stress effects. And we are also correcting for the reference number of cycles. We are choosing the reference cycles as 15. So for people who are more used to the magnitude scaling factor, so this term is essentially your 1 over magnitude scaling factor. We are also applying corrections for two-dimensional shaking in field and the K0 effects. Apart from these standard corrections, we are also implementing two more corrections for your test type as well as the specimen preparation method, so which are given by KT and KS. So these corrections are done as per Almar et al. 2024 and Bray and Sancho 2006. So after processing the data, so we have close to around 1100 data points, and the plots here show the histograms of all the different variables. One thing to note here is that more than 40 to 50% of the data consists of clean sands which are prepared under reconstitution methods like fluviation or sedimentation methods. As we go to high fines content, we have quite a number of intact specimens. So when we started to have a look at the data, it revealed a trend for us. So in this plot, we are showing a subset of the entire database. The blue points here indicate the coarse grain materials, which are relative density between 70 to 80%. The orange points in the middle are coarse fine mixtures with relative density in the same range. And your green points are fines dominated sands, and your red points are normally consolidated fine grain materials. So as you can see here, there is a transition we see as we move from low fines content to high fines content. We are moving from a certain high value to a low value at high fines content. So to model this, we are using a logistic curve to interpolate between two ends. So we are representing the ends as CRR sub S, which stands for the cyclic resistance of the coarse grain particles, CRR sub F, which refers to the CRR of the fine grain particles. It is important to note here that if we look at a different subset of the data, the curve can go the other way, start from a lower value and go to a higher value. Say we are considering relatively loose samples and highly over consolidated fine grain materials. So now moving on, we'll have to establish both these terms and see how the interpolation function turns out. So for establishing CRR sub S, we have directly adopted the triggering model from NGL, which is available in Almar et al. 2024. So we have directly used this model because most of the data from the present study was also used in this model development process. So the plot here shows the CRR of the coarse grain materials from our database as a versus relative density. So the solid and dashed lines are your median predictions along with the plus or minus 1 standard deviation. So for establishing CRR sub F, we are considering fine grain materials from our database. We are including only the intact and fluviated specimens with fines content greater than 35%. So we have developed a model through which we can evaluate CRR as a function of PI or OCR, and we have also ensured that during regression we are able to account for the sample type and test type. So these plots show the model predictions as a function of PI on the left plot, and as we see CRR versus OCR on the right plot. So the different lines here are for different plasticity index, and the orange points are essentially the data which have PI less than 10. So now that we have gotten our CRRS and CRRF, all that left to do is to plug them into the big equation and regress the parameters which control the interpolation. So it must be noted that only a small subset of the data could be used here, because we can use only data points which have all the 4 features available. Often when we go to high fines materials, we do not have a relative density measurement. So we were able to regress this curve from the data. So now moving on, let's have a look at how the fines are going to influence the penetration resistance. The major factor when it comes to influence of fines on penetration is that we have different types of drainage depending on the fines content. So for clean sands, we have completely drained condition during penetration, and for your fine grain materials you have completely undrained penetrations. For our mixtures, it's often known as partially drained, somewhere in between both these ends. So these are arising because of the changes in the hydraulic properties as fines are added to the coarse grain materials. Often in the literature, the influence of drainage during penetration is studied using variable rate CPTs. So we perform CPTs at different rates and see how the measured tip resistance is changing. So these studies are referenced using a normalized penetration velocity, which is given by this equation above. And as you can see, as we move from low penetration rates to high penetration rates, you transition from a completely drained penetration to completely undrained penetration. So there are limits in the literature as to infer how the drainage is going to be based on the values of V. So as a part of our present study, we have gathered data from 5 different studies. So firstly, we have 4 field test data from 4 different studies. So these are variable rate CPTs that are performed in sites that have silty sands or sandy silts. We also have data from 2 different chamber tests. So these are performed on artificially prepared blends of sand and fine grain soils. So one thing to note here is the chamber tests are often performed using mini cones and they do not have sleeve friction measurements. Hence, we don't have an I sub C. The plot here shows all the data which we have gathered from these studies. So to go over this plot, first the color code indicates the reference of the data and the symbol denotes the particular field or the particular specimen property of the chamber. So if we note here, the data which we have taken from these chamber tests are much higher than the field test data. So to explain this, we have 2 possible reasons. So some of these data points are influenced by boundary effects, which comes in to picture because of the chamber effects. Then another point to note here is that most of these specimens are artificially prepared by mixing 2 materials and hence they don't really represent the type of fabric we encounter in the field. So once you remove the outliers, your data looks like this. And when we try to use some sort of equation which is often used in the literature to see how your Q is measured tip resistance varies with V, we can regress a curve and you get a following equation. But when you think about it, V is usually not known in the field. So we don't really know the coefficient of consolidation. So to tackle this, we need to somehow link the data from these variable rate tests with cone penetration measurements like I sub C or I sub B. So in the literature, there are existing models regarding how you can infer the drainage as a function of I sub C as specified in Schneider et al. 2012, whereas Robertson 2016 specifies the use of I sub B to infer drainage during penetration. So we have followed a approach to decompose all the data from these variable rate tests. So this plot shows a field test that was performed as a part of Kim et al. 2008. On the top we have the measured tip resistance and on the bottom we have the excess pore pressure. So from this we can infer that the point at the top is going to be a drain CPT since our excess pore pressure is almost 0. And the point here is going to be a undrained tip resistance because it's well within the range of V, which qualifies as undrained penetration. We also have a standard tip resistance. For this case, it's same as the undrained CPT case. Now we are trying to use this information and transfer it to a different space. So to do that, we are using 2 different plots. The first plot, we are normalizing the standard CPT with respect to undrained tip resistance, and on the second plot, we are normalizing the standard CPT with respect to the drained CPT. So as we repeat all this approach for all the data which we have gathered, we get all these points which are shown in both these plots. Then we go ahead and fit a sigmoid function to this data. So we are limiting the maximum value in the first plot since we don't really know how much data in this region. So it can essentially go very high values if we don't put any condition on them. So let me quickly go over the summary. So first we started off with understanding the influence of fines on CRR, and we put forth the preliminary framework which can explain the inconsistencies which are seen in the literature. Then we have also proposed a model based on which we can correct our measured tip resistance to equivalent drained or undrained tip resistances. So the future work can be focused on integrating the measured CPT quantities with the CRR. So to do that, we have our standard CPTs. So you go to these curves, and based on your I sub C, you apply the corrections and get your undrained and drained tip resistance. Then you can integrate them into the CRR sub S or CRR sub F. And with that, we can possibly verify how if the existing correction factors are able to account for both these effects. Yeah, so these are my references. That's all. You can